bonjour and welcome. But most importantly, folks, I'm well, you but to another episode of Bungi Beat. And of course, you're with your host, Alexandria Anthony. And today I am beyond thrilled. I'm so excited to have a very special guest join us on the Bungi Beat, Elaine Gold, PhD, who is also the director of the Canadian Language Museum, Glendon Gallery, Glendon Campus, North York, Ontario, York University, and the website is languagemuseum.ca. So, beyond thrilled to have Elaine Gold joining us today on the Bungi Beat. But before we get into our exciting guest, and a lot of our listeners have asked me, what exactly is Scottish Gaelic? And it's really a Celtic language spoken mainly in the Highlands and the Islands of Western Scotland, and its origins can be traced back as far as the 10th century, folks. And the word Bungi itself is probably of Ojibwa origins from panke, meaning a little or a portion of something. So, as well, Bungi's most notable feature is its phonologically and its phonetic system, and of course its pronunciation. And folks, let's face it, we really need to normalize Métis languages, dialects. We need to really, and let's put it plainly, folks, we really need to make it hip and cool to speak our Métis languages and dialect, folks. And Bungi, the Red River Dialect, we need to use it, folks. We need to use it, or we'll just completely lose it, and we can't allow that to happen. So let's get right into one of my favorite parts of the show and talk Bungi to me. And this today from Canon Sanderson, Kenora, Ontario, January 15th, 1938. And it's to the editor of the Winnipeg Evening Tribune. And this is the title of this particular article: Canon Sanderson Drops into Red River Dialect. And here we go, folks. Sir, am sewer. You will be glad to know that a lot of people reads your pepper, because a lot of people says to me, so you prayed God to shave the queen, and you can't deny it neither, because it's wrote in the news peppers. And one time, even, mind you, a letter came to me with a piece cut out of a newspaper, and it said how a young fella, meaning me, was learning how to be a minister, and he couldn't say shh. And a great larned man tried larn him to say shh, and he larned him and larned him, and when he thought he larned him properly, the young man was sent to help a minister in his parish, and the newspaper said he larned so properly to say shh one time when he reading the morning prayers in church, I guess, where he was helping the minister in his parish, mind you, by didn't that young fellow go and say, God shave the queen, when he sort of said, God save the queen. Well, by when I read that piece what was cut out of the pepper, I took my old book and I looked for where it said in the service that is read in church every Sunday, God save the Queen, just to make sure, you know. Mind you, boy, I couldn't find it. I found whatever where it said, "Oh Lord, save the Queen," but I couldn't find where the book said, "God save the Queen." So I says to myself, somebody is just saying that for nothing again. But I think the man what wrote that must have got his story peeny askew, because when I tried to think on when somebody learned me to say shh, boy, I couldn't mind 'cept when I was a little fella, as every little boy and girl has to learn when they start to go to school. And then again, I tried to mind too when I helped Mr. Anderson in his Paris, and mind you, I couldn't remember that neither. And so I says to myself, once more, boys, someone's just trying to be funny again. But I'll write to the man what makes the newspapers and tell him about it. So will you please put this in your pepper, so as people will see it the same as they saw the other piece. That's all. Thank you, Mr. Editor, and hoping these few lines will find you in the same state of good health as they leave me. Canon M. Sanderson, of course, from Kenora, Ontario. And let's get right into our special guest today, Elaine Gold, PhD, Director of the Canadian Language Museum. First, I want to, I really want to welcome. We have a very, very special guest joining us on the Bungi Beat, and it's Elaine Gold, PhD, director also of the Canadian Language Museum. And before we really sort of get right into some Bungi, I want to say, I'm well, you butt. And I love using that sort of standard Bungi greeting. Could you tell our listeners the importance of the work that you do? It's so very, very important.
Okay, well, at the Canadian Language Museum, uh, we have a number of projects that we do with a big focus on supporting the maintenance of Indigenous languages in Canada. And one way, the main way that we do that is by creating small traveling exhibits about different languages or language topics in Canada. And these exhibits are small and fairly inexpensive. And so they're able to tour around to community centers and libraries and schools all across Canada. And it's one way of raising awareness about Indigenous languages and about the work going on for revitalization. So, for example, right now our exhibit about the Cree language is touring in Alberta, and the exhibit about the Inuit language has also just finished touring in Alberta. So we have exhibits touring around the country. And then we also make exhibits about other language issues in Canada. So, for example, we have an exhibit about sign languages in Canada, and we found 6 sign languages, and 3 of them are Indigenous. And so, again, that exhibit has been touring around the country, and people are learning more about the different sign languages and also Indigenous sign language through that exhibit.
Wow, I think you really hit on a pivotal point. That's sort of a passion project for me when you said the word awareness. Myself being a Métis with Red River roots, it's so important to create awareness. And I know that I've read that you had a long career as a teacher, and I think who better to be the director of the Canadian Language Museum? And if I may stand corrected, you can correct me. It's located in Glendon Gallery, Glendon campus in North York, Ontario. Is that correct?
That is absolutely correct. Correct. Glendon campus is a campus of York University. It's a very lovely campus. It was an estate, and it's on the banks of the West Don River, and beautiful treed campus. So it's just a beautiful location to be in, and that's where the museum is located.
And can people come and when you say museum, and a lot of our listeners, can they actually come and visit the museum and see exhibits?
That's right. When I started the museum, I was still teaching at the University of Toronto, and we didn't have an exhibit space. So we just all our focus was on our traveling exhibits. But then about 7 years ago, Glendon campus gave me this lovely gallery space. And so now we do both. We have the traveling exhibits going out, but we also have exhibits in our exhibit space, and the public is welcome to come and see it. And we also get student groups coming through to see the exhibit. So it's another way of educating, excuse me, of educating and reaching people.
Absolutely. And I know that you have said that you are interested in the three contact languages in Canada. Number one, Bungi, Bungi, Michif, and Chinook jargon. Could you, a lot of our listeners are Métis, they're Indigenous from across Canada into the United States. They may not be familiar what the term a contact language means. With your vast experience, your knowledge, what's a simple word or a simple way to put the meaning of a contact language?
Okay. Well, I think the easiest way to think about it is a language that develops when at least two, sometimes more than two, quite different languages come in contact. For example, with Métis, you have the European language, French, coming in contact with indigenous languages, mostly Algonquian languages. And then together, the contact of these two languages, and of course, when I say language contact, it's really people contact. It's people coming in contact who speak these different languages, and then together, usually very often because of marriage, and then raising children together, a new language develops that's a blend of these languages. And Métis is an amazing example of that, where it is very much a combination of French and Algonquian languages, mostly Cree, but not completely, where you cannot understand it if you know one or the other. If you just know French, can't understand Métis. If you just know Cree, for example, you can't understand Métis. It's a very interesting combination of the two. So for Bungi, it's a combination, again, mostly of Cree with Scots English. So it was people coming together who spoke these two different languages. And then with Chinook jargon is a really interesting contact language because people think that it was already a contact language, a trade language between different indigenous nations before the colonizers arrived. And so it already had different West Coast vocabulary from different West Coast languages in it. And then when English and French people arrived, especially because of the gold rush back in the 1800s, then words from English and French also started coming into it, and grammar from English and French. So again, very interesting contact language between indigenous peoples and colonizers. So all three of the languages that we're talking about arose because of contact between people who spoke indigenous languages and people who spoke colonizing languages, English and French.
Well, that makes perfect sense because a prime example in my genealogy or my family heritage that Cuthbert Grant Sr. was a Highlander. He left Cromdale and Scotland with his brother Robert Grant to become forming partners of then the Northwest Company. So they would have
Right.
come over completely fluent, of course, in Gaelic. So, of
Uh-huh.
course, he married an Indigenous woman, Cuthbert Grant Jr. arrived, that I'm related through that line. So that makes perfect sense when you're describing a contact language, the intermarrying, because they married Indigenous women, of course, because they knew the law, the way to survive in the wilderness. There was, again, trading posts. So that's really where you're saying that Bungi emerged from marriages between Scottish settlers, Aboriginal women, and of course the languages that were spoken at the trading post. And it's interesting too, growing up, my grandfather was, I mean, French was spoken in the home, and I realized after it was Michif as well. And you sit there as a child absorbing all these languages and not realizing the importance and significance of preserving this for the future because it's a part of Canadian history that involves all of us because again all these Highlanders and Orkney Islands and people from all over that came to seek, fame and fortune or a better world in Canada. Sort of, it was an influx, and I think what I like is that in that CBC article, the statement that you said that at first glance, and I quote, at first glance, a speaker of Bungi has just, it's almost like they just arrived from Scotland, and then you find out after that they're a fourth generation indigenous speaker. And again, for me, growing up in Selkirk, there was a huge population of Bungi speakers that I heard as a child, and I would sit there and it was just almost a mystery that you wonder, you hear it all the time growing up as a child, but you don't really put any significance into it until later on when I was able to go back several times to Scotland and dig deeper into my roots and the correlation with Gaelic and I was able even at one time to meet with the Scottish First Minister and talk about the Métis, the Scottish, and the similarities and how they want to learn about the people that came from Scotland and settled Canada. But I really I think it's important, and I love that statement when you're saying that because when I started doing the Bungi beat, a lot of people were just perplexed, if that's
Uh-huh.
for a lack of a better word, not knowing what it was. And I think it's so important for us to, again, like you said, create awareness. And we can't let these dialects or languages become extinct.
Yes, I think people don't realize how rich I would call it the language environment was around the Red River settlement and north towards, the Hudson Bay with all of those different languages coming together, Gaelic, French, English, all the Algonquian languages. Yeah, and so not that many people have heard of Bungi, which is very interesting. And unfortunately, there aren't that many speakers. Well, I don't know if there's any speakers left. Do you know of anyone who's a native speaker of Bungi who spoke it as a child?
There's very few speakers that I still live in Selkirk where I'm from,
Yeah.
elderly people that have contacted me. And I think it's interesting too, Elaine, that since I started to do my episodes on reciting Bungi, I actually have had listeners uh, contact me and have say that they have tears in their eyes because it brings back memories of a dialect or a language that they've heard their grandparents or their parents speak, and they're just overwhelmed with emotion that they're hearing it again. And I did recite, several episodes, and it's made such an impact to hear, I
Mhm.
mean, to hear it being spoken.
Yeah. No, I can totally understand that. And people, I think, have a gut feeling about how important language is to culture. And when they hear that language, it just brings back that whole culture, a lot of which is unfortunately gone and associated with their grandparents. And I can see that it's very emotional.
Yeah, and I think it sort of it unifies people, and it gives a sense of kinship, belonging, and a sense of community. And as Indigenous people, for us, a sense of belonging somewhere, with colonization and everything that's happening with residential schools, etc. People need to feel like they belong to a group. And again, like I said. When I was interviewed about it from a newspaper in my hometown, Selkirk, they were amazed. They said, we didn't even know that this was so big back in the day in Selkirk, being
Mhm.
part of the Red River. They said this is a huge part of our history that has to be remembered for the youth,
Yeah.
and it's so important. I think that's why it's so important in what you do as a director. And when I read about what you've done in your exhibits, and I thought this is absolutely amazing that you have traveling exhibitions that people can come and see that you're. I think it's important for people to sort of be a part of history, be immersed in history, because it leaves more of an impact. Because I know I've done volunteer work at different historical places with Parks Canada and stuff. And to see the look on the face of a child when they can touch history or they can hear history instead of being in a book, it just be, a sense of wonderment, and they retain it more, I think.
Yes, I think that's very true, and I think the exhibit, seen in exhibit, about a language, well, it does two things. So for people who aren't familiar with that language and it's not their culture, it just gives them appreciation of that language and culture. And for people where that is their culture and language, it's a validation that their language is important enough to have an exhibit about and something that they should be proud of and sharing with other people. So I like to feel that it provides that to different communities that way.
Absolutely. And I
Yeah.
know that I've read several instances where Bungi has also been described as post Creole. Is that something that you sort of agree with? Because a lot of in post Creole, I think simply means that it's sort of Creole is born when two different languages sort of confine, like you said, combine to form
Mhm.
another language.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I'm not sure about that term post Creole. There's certainly usually what people use is they often use the word pigeon for a contact language that just beginning but isn't used very widely. And then they use a Creole for a language that is used quite widely. And I would certainly think that, Bungie falls into that. And I'm not exactly sure. So I don't want to go there with what people mean with post Creole.
Yeah,
If they mean something that has become, I mean, possibly they mean something that has become more somehow formalized. And I will, if that's what they mean, it's not a word, it's not a term that I have used. If they mean something that's become more formalized, then that wouldn't apply to Bungie because it's not the sort of Creole. I even not crazy about that term, but that's why I like the word contact language or mixed language. Um, Bungie never became formalized to the point of having textbooks written in it or it being used in schools. Like it's never been formalized to that extent. And I suspect when they use the term post Creole, they might be meaning something that has become a little more formalized.
right. Because I know that when I've spoken to several elderly bungee speakers, they did express to me that there was some type of discrimination, or they didn't feel comfortable openly speaking Bungi Bungi, that I don't know if it was they thought that they one person said that they would be laughed at, or they would be feel
Uh-huh.
ashamed of speaking it in
Uh-huh.
public, because they thought it was people would I sort of couldn't wrap my head around that concept, but that's what a lot of elderly people told me, that that's why they rarely spoke it, behind closed doors, because there was that
Uh-huh.
embarrassment.
Yeah. I think there's two things going on there. First of all, I've certainly heard that from people who speak any Indigenous language, that their parents told them not to speak it just because of the widespread racism against anyone speaking Indigenous language. So there's partly that. But I think with Bungi too, that if you were to a school, that some teachers might say that's not proper English. You're not speaking proper English. Speak real English. And so, because mostly it kind of sounds like English, and so it sounds like it's not proper. So they might have had that idea that teachers wouldn't approve of it, or somehow they sound like they don't know proper English. So I can imagine that that's true,
Yeah,
that
because
that might have happened. They would have felt some discrimination because of that.
I know, like,
Yeah.
there's been some data that they said in 1870 there were around 5,000 Bungi Bungai speakers, and then in 1993 there was less than 200, and then now they're saying that it's basically potentially extinct.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I think you have a few things going on there. And one thing is, obviously, if people went to schools, either residential schools or even local schools where they're being taught in English, they would have been encouraged, shall we say, forced to use a more standard English. And then that's what they might have taught to their own children. And on the other hand, I think what might be happening today is that people might move towards another Indigenous language. So if they're in a community where there's also Bungi and Cree, or Bungi and Metis, there might be some movement to one of the other bigger languages.
Yeah, and
And so,
I
yeah,
agree.
that might happen.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. But I think, to me, that one of the things that sort of excites me, or makes me, is that the Bungi Bungai really centered on the Red River in north in Manitoba, and that's why I think in my mind that
Yeah,
people in Manitoba should be embracing it, celebrating it,
yeah,
really making it a part of their history, and create more of awareness,
yeah,
especially in Manitoba.
hmm yeah, for sure,
And
for sure.
also, yeah, that's why I think it's very, very important. And I know that uh, people will want to know, and you can answer or not answer. I read that had a long career in teaching. Could I ask what you were a teacher of, if you don't mind?
Oh, not at all. I'm a linguist, and so I was teaching linguistics at the University of Toronto. And within linguistics, there's different aspects. So some of linguistics is very technical, where you really talk about the structure of languages or the sounds of languages, but other parts are more social. And one of the courses that I taught was about languages of Canada, and so that's one reason I would be teaching my students about Bungi and Metis and Chinook jargon, because I wanted them to know about the different languages that had been spoken in Canada. So I was already teaching about these languages even before I founded the museum.
Oh, that's it. That's incredible. And I know that I've read also that a gentleman called Brian Orvis, who was a Bungi Bungai speaker, again from Selkirk, uh, he made a statement saying that the speakers did not like to be recorded speaking the language, because he said that First Nation values are one that should not call attention to oneself. Have you ever heard that, dealing with different languages, or indigenous languages or dialects?
Well, I've certainly heard about, the the cultural attitude of not drawing attention to oneself. I think that there has been a fair bit of suspicion between Indigenous communities and universities or non-Indigenous researchers, where people would rightly might be hesitant to have their voices recorded because they weren't sure what would happen to those recordings or how they would be used. So I can understand why some people might have been hesitant to be recorded in the past.
Yeah, that
makes sense. There are some recordings at the University of Manitoba. Those are the ones that I know about. But you're right, there aren't very many.
Have you actually you haven't listened to those recordings in the university, have you?
Oh no, I have.
Oh, yeah.
Well, it's a while ago. That's why I was saying when you quoted me where I said it sounds like someone who's just come from Scotland,
Yeah.
even though they're actually just. That's because I was listening to those recordings, and so I was flabbergasted because I actually never met in person people who spoke Bungi as a first language, but there are some recordings at University of Manitoba that one could go and listen to. So I had listened to those recordings.
Oh, that's great. But it has also been said that Bungi was spoken with sort of a distinctive rhythm and a Gaelic fall. Would you sort of agree, or is that something that you sort of, listening to those recordings yourself, would you agree with that?
Oh, definitely a distinct rhythm, and also, as I said, kind of a sing-song quality that to me sounds Scottish. Whether it's Gaelic or Scottish English also has that rhythm or tune, you might say. So yes, for sure. You can definitely hear the contact between the people who came from Scotland or from the Orkneys and the Indigenous people. You can hear it in the speech.
Have yourself, Elaine, traveled to like Scotland or the Orkneys where you could sort of hear native speakers of Gaelic themselves and then come back and say, okay, yeah, I can kind of hear that?
I haven't been to the Orkneys, so I actually have never heard anyone from the Orkneys, so I can't tell you how they speak. I've definitely been to Scotland, and there's a variety of accents depending on whether you're from the Highlands. As you mentioned, you've been to the Highlands or the Lowlands. So yes, I could definitely recognize that it was a Scottish element that I was hearing in the Bungi speech when I was listening to the tapes.
That's amazing. So, before we let you go, and like I said, I know your time is extremely valuable, and I appreciate the time that you've given to me and to our listeners. That we're very appreciative and grateful. What would be your message to listeners on the importance of preserving and educating people on Indigenous languages and dialects in Canada?
Well, I think you've said it very well. That it's extremely important to be proud of these languages, and if you have an Indigenous language within your own personal inheritance, that to try to learn it and try to pass it on. I think it's really important. This is the only place in the world where they are, and this is a very important generation in terms of keeping those languages and being able to pass them on. So if you're able to do that, I would highly encourage it.
That's great. And I know that Bungi also is classified as, of course, critically endangered by the UNESCO Atlas of the World's Languages in Danger. Do any work with the United Nations or UNESCO, or is it just basically through the Canadian Language Museum?
We're not doing any work directly with United Nations UNESCO. We certainly feel that we were part of the International Year of Indigenous Languages. So that was a UNESCO year 2019. And now we feel that what we're doing, that our projects are part of the International Decade of Indigenous Languages, which we are in right now. Beyond that, I wouldn't say that we're in direct contact with UNESCO or the United Nations in any way, but we're certainly um, involved with language museums around the world, and we share information about techniques for maintaining Indigenous languages. In fact, I was just in Taiwan, where I was met people there who are working with the Indigenous languages in Taiwan, and they were very interested in what's going on in Canada for preserving Indigenous languages in Canada, and they're looking forward to more contact with Indigenous people, not just with me, but with Indigenous people who are working on maintaining Indigenous languages in Canada.
That's absolutely amazing. And I think, I'm just very honored to be able to have you on the show. And you're really a champion, I think, for Indigenous languages. And I'm grateful that you're out there and creating awareness, having these traveling exhibitions. It's in the Canadian Language Museum. If anybody can get down there and to visit, it's just such a worthwhile cause. And like I said, you're a champion for us Indigenous people. And I didn't ask you if you're Indigenous yourself. That's no matter here nor there. But we're grateful for individuals like you that are going above and beyond to help our, because really languages are a part of who we are. Kinship, community, and languages, it's part of our DNA, who we are. And like I said, to have somebody of your caliber to be out there and uh, you know showcasing, I think it's absolutely incredible, and I have to really thank you.
Well, I truly appreciate that. I'm really somewhat blushing by all the wonderful things you have said. I do want to say for your listeners that they can go to our website. So just Google Canadian Language Museum, because the content of all our exhibits is there on the website. And we also have a booklet that's free to download about Indigenous languages in Canada. And so there's a lot of information there. And of course, we're continually trying to increase that information and improve it.
That's incredible. I'm going to have all those links in the description of this video so our listeners can click those links. And again, so appreciated of your time. I know it's valuable, but thank you again for sharing your vast experience and your vast knowledge to myself and our listeners. I'm extremely grateful, Elaine.
Okay, well, it's been absolutely my pleasure.